time traveler. Jack Dawson might be a time traveler sent back to 1912. The theory points to several historical impossibilities in his dialogue that fans noticed immediately after the film's 1997 release. Jack mentions fishing at Lake Wissota in Chippewa Falls, Wisconsin, but this man-made lake wasn't created until 1917, 5 years after the ship sank. He also promises Rose a ride on the roller coaster at Santa Monica Pier, which wasn't built until 1916. Supporters argue Jack gambled for his ticket because he didn't have currency from 1912, and his rucksack style wasn't popular until the 1930s. The theory suggests Jack specifically boarded the ship to save Rose from jumping, because if she had jumped, the crew would have stopped to search for her, delaying the voyage and avoiding the iceberg entirely. While these are likely just script research errors, the theory remains possible because these anachronisms exist in the film, and no official explanation has been provided. The accumulation of these historical mistakes gives fans just enough material to construct a time travel narrative that technically can't be disproven. Ship switch. The Olympic and Titanic may have been secretly swapped in an insurance fraud scheme. This elaborate theory originated from Robin Gardner's 1998 book claiming the ship that sank wasn't actually Titanic at all. The Olympic collided with HMS Hawke on September 20th, 1911, suffering significant damage to its starboard side. Both ships were at the Harland and Wolff shipyard in Belfast during repairs, creating an opportunity for the alleged switch. The theory argues the White Star Line wanted to avoid paying for Olympic's expensive repairs and collect insurance money by deliberately sinking the damaged ship disguised as Titanic. The possibility exists because both ships were physically similar, and both were at the same location simultaneously. However, Titanic was worth $7.5 million, but only insured for $5 million, meaning the company actually lost $2.5 million when it sank. All recovered artifacts bear the number 401, Titanic's yard number, not 400 for Olympic. Despite being thoroughly challenged by maritime historians, the theory persists because the logistical opportunity for a switch technically existed, even though the financial motivation completely contradicts it. Imaginary Jack. Jack Dawson might never have existed at all. A theory from around 2017 proposes he was Rose's psychological creation to help her cope with her arranged marriage to Cal Hockley. The elderly Rose tells treasure hunters there's no record of Jack anywhere on the ship, and she mysteriously responds that he exists now only in her memory. Jack appears precisely when Rose needs him most, literally saving her from jumping off the back of the ship. The theory suggests Rose experienced a mental break to escape her miserable engagement, and Jack represents her inner strength and desire for freedom. Proponents point to how Jack is why she can fly at the bow in the most famous scene, symbolizing the liberation she grants herself. The door debate becomes irrelevant under this interpretation because he was never physically there to save. The theory remains possible because the film is told entirely from elderly Rose's perspective as a memory, and memories can be unreliable or embellished. While this requires ignoring scenes where Jack clearly interacts with other passengers independently, the narrative framework of an old woman recalling events from 8 decades ago leaves room for subjective interpretation. Coal fire. A smoldering coal fire might have weakened the ship's hull before it ever hit the iceberg. Historical records confirm a fire was detected in Bunker 6 between boiler rooms 5 and 6 while the ship was in Southampton. The fire burned for approximately 10 days total and was caused by spontaneous combustion, which was actually common on coal-burning ships of that era. Irish journalist Sinan Maloney advanced the theory in a 2017 documentary, claiming photographs show a 30-foot black mark on the starboard hull where the fire burned. Ohio State University engineer Robert Essenhigh had presented a version in 2004, suggesting the crew increase speed to burn through coal faster, trying to reach and extinguish the fire. The theory argues temperatures between 932 and 1,832 degrees Fahrenheit weakened the steel bulkhead at the exact point where the iceberg later struck. The fire definitely existed, which is documented fact, creating possibility for the theory. However, coal bunker fires were extremely common and had standard protocols, and the fire was extinguished on Saturday night, April 13th, 1 day before the collision. The biggest problem is the first-class swimming pool was directly above the affected bulkhead, and passengers would have noticed boiling water. The theory remains technically possible because the fire did occur in that location, but maritime experts have explained why it couldn't have been the decisive factor. Morgan assassination. J.P. Morgan may have orchestrated the disaster to eliminate 3 wealthy opponents. The theory claims John Jacob Astor IV, Benjamin Guggenheim, and Isidor Straus all died in the sinking because they opposed Morgan's plan to create the U.S. Federal Reserve, which was established in 1913, just 1 year later. Morgan controlled the White Star Line and had booked a personal suite for the maiden voyage, but canceled last minute, citing illness, while he remained at the French resort Aix-les-Bains for morning massages and sulfur baths. The timing creates just enough coincidence for the theory to persist. However, no evidence exists that Astor or Guggenheim ever spoke publicly against the Federal Reserve, and Straus actually spoke in favor of centralized banking. All 3 men would have profited from the system just as much as Morgan. The theory requires impossible logistics because Morgan would need to guarantee the ship hit an iceberg at a specific location in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. Alternative versions claim the Rothschild banking family or Jesuits orchestrated the deaths instead. The possibility exists only in the suspicious timing of Morgan's cancellation and the convenient deaths of wealthy businessmen 1 year before the Federal Reserve's creation. But the complete lack of evidence for their opposition and the logistical impossibility make this highly unlikely, despite remaining technically unproven. Gatsby Connection. Jack Dawson might have survived and become Jay Gatsby. This playful theory suggests that in an alternate timeline, Jack washed ashore and stole the Heart of the Ocean necklace, replacing it with a replica before faking his death in the water. He arrives in New York in 1912, changes his name to Jay Gatsby, and builds mysterious wealth through the 1920s. The theory points to Gatsby's secretive nature about his past and his fear of water, potentially from trauma. Both characters fall for women named after flowers who are engaged to wealthy men they hate, and both die young, with Gatsby drowning in a pool as a cruel echo of Jack's fate. The timeline works perfectly because The Great Gatsby is set in Long Island in 1922, exactly 10 years after the disaster. The theory gained traction after Baz Luhrmann's 2013 film starring Leonardo DiCaprio in both roles. The possibility exists because we never see Jack's body recovered, and the film's ending leaves his fate technically open to interpretation. The major flaw is no explanation for how Jack could create a replica of such an expensive diamond necklace. But since both stories are fictional, fans enjoy connecting them through the shared actor and thematic similarities. Submarine Attack. A German U-boat might have torpedoed the ship. Some theorists claim explosions heard after the iceberg collision came from submarine torpedoes rather than structural collapse. The first German U-boat was commissioned in 1906, 6 years before the disaster, and German submarine U-20 later sank the Lusitania on May 7, 1915. Killing nearly 1,200 people. Multiple survivors reported hearing explosions after the collision, and some crew members of the nearby Californian reported mysterious lights between the ships around 2 in the morning. Theorists claim the lights could have been a surface submarine assessing damage. The theory remains technically possible, because German submarines did exist and were operational in 1912. However, Third Officer Herbert Pittman testified the explosions were bulkheads carrying away during structural collapse. Passenger Charles Stengel confirmed hearing 4 sharp explosions when the bow and stern ripped apart. The ship took 2 hours and 40 minutes to sink, while the Lusitania sank in just 18 minutes after a confirmed torpedo strike, suggesting very different types of damage. Most critically, World War I didn't start until 1914, 2 years later, and Kaiser Wilhelm was not conducting pre-war terrorism against civilian liners. No contemporary accounts mention a loud explosion at the moment of impact, which a torpedo absolutely would have caused. The possibility exists only in the presence of German submarine technology and unexplained lights, but the evidence overwhelmingly points to internal structural failure. Ismay Orders. J. Bruce Ismay might have ordered the ship to keep moving after the collision. The theory claims that after the ship struck the iceberg, Ismay, chairman of the White Star Line, pressured Captain Smith to continue sailing rather than stopping immediately. Louise Patton, granddaughter of Second Officer Lightoller, alleged in 2010 that Ismay wanted to protect the company's reputation by attempting to reach port rather than waiting for rescue in the middle of the Atlantic. The theory argues that continuing to move forward for even 10 minutes dramatically increased water pressure against the damaged hull, accelerating the flooding and reducing the time the ship stayed afloat by potentially hours. If the ship had remained completely stopped, it might have floated long enough for the Carpathia or other rescue vessels to arrive before it sank. The possibility exists because Ismay was aboard and had significant influence as the owner's representative, and survivor accounts suggest the engines did continue running briefly after impact. Historical records show Ismay survived by boarding a lifeboat, which damaged his reputation and led to accusations of cowardice. However, no testimony from the official inquiries directly confirms Ismay gave such an order. and Captain Smith had final authority over the vessel. The theory remains possible because the chain of command and decision-making in those critical minutes remains somewhat unclear, leaving room for speculation about Ismay's role. Speed record. The ship might have been attempting to break the transatlantic speed record. The theory claims Captain Smith and J. Bruce Ismay wanted to arrive in New York early to generate publicity, which explains ignoring multiple iceberg warnings throughout April 14th. The ship was traveling at approximately 22.5 knots when it struck the iceberg, which some consider dangerously fast for conditions. The theory remains possible because ambition and corporate pressure could have influenced navigation decisions. However, the ship was designed for luxury and comfort, not speed, with a maximum capability of only about 23 knots. The Cunard Line's Lusitania held the actual speed record, with 26.06 knots westbound and 26.25 knots eastbound. The ship was physically incapable of breaking these records, no matter how hard it tried. The speed it was traveling was actually standard practice for the time in clear weather, and official inquiries found nothing unusual about maintaining high speed despite ice warnings, as this was common before the disaster changed maritime protocols. The possibility exists only in the theoretical motivation of wanting good publicity, but the ship's technical specifications make an actual record attempt impossible. The real explanation is more mundane, that captains regularly maintained high speeds because it was simply standard practice, not because they were racing. Door debate. Both Jack and Rose might have survived on the floating door. The theory emerged immediately after the film's 1997 release, with fans arguing the wooden panel appears large enough for both people. MythBusters tackled this in a 2012 episode, testing whether both could have survived by tying life vests underneath the door to increase buoyancy. Their method worked under controlled conditions, proving it was technically possible. Director James Cameron defended his ending in a 2017 interview, stating it says on page 147 of the script that Jack dies and the door was big enough to hold her but not big enough to hold him, by artistic choice. Cameron explained Jack didn't know Rose would be rescued in an hour, and the water was fatal in minutes. In 2022, Cameron commissioned a scientific study with a hypothermia expert, using stunt people the same body mass as the actors in ice water with sensors. The study concluded there was no way they both could have survived through various tested methods. A special documentary about the findings aired in February 2023. The theory remains possible because MythBusters demonstrated the physics could work under certain conditions, and we're debating a fictional scenario where the writer controls all variables. The door's size in the film appears adequate, creating a visual contradiction with the narrative outcome. However, Cameron argues the real point was Jack's sacrifice and Rose's survival, not the specific physics of buoyancy. The possibility exists in the gap between what looks physically possible on screen and what the story required dramatically, though the director has now provided both artistic and scientific defenses of his choice. If you found this interesting, consider subscribing so you never miss new content. Thanks for watching.